The winds that swept across the Dakota plains carried more than the bite of winter. They carried the echoes of forgotten dreams, the kind that whispered to lonely souls in the silence of endless horizons. Samuel Whitlock moved through that silence like a shadow, his figure tall yet bent by the weight of memories he could never bury. The cabin he built with his own hands stood as both refuge and prison, a place where his heart learned to grow quiet, where days blended into nights without the warmth of laughter or the softness of a familiar voice. Yet in that stillness, where only the fire and his faithful horse kept him company, there was a strange beauty, like the quiet healing of wounds no one could see, a mending of spirit that came from the very rhythm of survival. He carried the mark of a man who had fled from the world, but the world, in its mysterious ways, was not finished with him. For beyond the ridges of the Black Hills, destiny was already moving closer, wrapped in blood, pain, and the fragile spark of life that would alter everything he thought he had chosen. The first snow drifted in slow, ghost-like veils across the valley, and Samuel's breath rose in steady clouds as he tracked the signs of deer along the ravine. Every step echoed with solitude, every heartbeat a reminder of the years he had surrendered to silence. And yet, that day would not end in silence. A broken cry rose from the brush, thin, trembling, utterly human. His hand froze on the rifle, his pulse quickened, and for the first time in years he felt the weight of choice pressing on his chest. There, hidden beneath tangled branches, lay not an animal, but a young woman, her skin pale with fever, her dress soaked with blood, an arrow lodged deep in her shoulder. Her eyes, dark and burning with defiance, locked onto his, and in that gaze was something that pierced deeper than any blade. It was as if the plains themselves had given him back the voice he had long buried. He could walk away, let the winds carry her life into the snow, or he could bend, touch, heal, and in doing so begin to unravel the chains of his own silence. And so he knelt, reaching past fear and suspicion, his hands trembling yet steady with purpose. The moment he brushed aside the branches, the story of his exile began to shift, turning not toward the cold comfort of solitude, but toward a fire that would demand his heart. The plains that once echoed with loneliness now promised the pulse of something far greater, a bond woven by chance, tested by pain, and destined to bloom in the harshest of seasons. If this tale warms your soul, let your voice be part of it. Share your thoughts, leave a light of encouragement in the comments, and stay close by subscribing so that every new story of love, healing and courage finds its way into your heart. For even in the coldest winds, a spark of connection can turn silence into song and solitude into the beginning of love's most unexpected journey. The cabin flickered with the dim glow of a lantern, shadows bending across rough-hewn walls as Samuel laid the wounded girl upon his narrow cot. The air smelled of smoke, pine resin, and the sharp bite of whiskey, yet beneath it lingered something new, an unfamiliar tremor of hope. Her breathing came shallow and fevered, each fragile rise of her chest pulling at him more deeply than he wished to admit. The arrow had splintered against bone, leaving shards of pain inside her body, and though his hands were steady from years of work, they shook now with a weight he had long forgotten, the weight of another life depending on him. He heated the blade until it glowed, whispered a prayer he no longer believed in, and with care torn from his very soul, he drew the broken iron from her flesh. Her cry, sharp and fleeting, cut through the silence like a storm. When it was done, blood welled against his palms, but so too did the beginning of trust, thin, fragile, like the first warmth of spring pressing through frozen ground. Through the endless hours of night, Samuel sat by her side, cooling her fevered brow with damp cloths, coaxing broth between her lips when she stirred, listening to the storm rattle against the shutters. He had not tended another human soul in years, yet now every breath she drew bound him tighter to her survival. His solitude had been chosen, his silence deliberate. But this girl's trembling breaths forced him to remember that life was not meant to be endured alone. There was healing here, not only in the herbs crushed beneath his fingertips, but in the simple act of care, in the reminder that his hands could still save, not only destroy. When dawn finally broke through the cracks of the cabin walls, the fever that had threatened to steal her spirit began to loosen its grip. Her lashes fluttered, her eyes, deep brown streaked with amber, opened, fierce and suspicious, yet alive. She studied him as one studies both enemy and savior, and in her gaze Samuel saw a reflection of himself, wounded, wary, yet unwilling to surrender. The fire cracked softly, the wind outside fading into whispers, and between them stretched a silence that no longer felt empty but alive with unspoken meaning. She would not thank him, not yet, but she did not push him away either. Instead, she drank from the cup he offered with trembling fingers, her pride still intact even in her weakness. Samuel felt the shift like the first thaw of winter, slow, steady, inevitable. His life of exile had been built upon walls of wood and stone, yet with her presence those walls began to breathe. The cabin was no longer just a cage of regrets. It had become a place where something fragile might grow, and as he watched the color return faintly to her cheeks, Samuel knew with a certainty as sharp as any blade that his days of silence were ending. The story had only begun, and with each breath she drew beside him, it carried them both closer to a bond neither solitude nor suspicion could contain. Her voice came haltingly at first, broken between her language and the fragments of English she carried. Yet each word slipped into the quiet of the cabin like a stone cast upon still water. "You, white man," she whispered, her tone edged with suspicion. Samuel rested the blade he had been sharpening, his grey eyes meeting hers without flinching. "Samuel Whitlock," he said simply, offering his name as if it were a fragile truth. She shifted against the blanket, pain tightening her features, her hand brushing the wound that still throbbed beneath bandages torn from his own shirt. "You cut me," she said, her words sharp, though her voice trembled. "I pulled the arrow," he replied, his tone level, a steady anchor against the storm of her doubt. "Would have killed you if I hadn't." Silence pressed between them then, heavy and searching, her gaze lingering on him as if to unravel what hidden snare might be waiting. He felt the heat of her eyes, the unspoken accusation, the unyielding will of someone who had survived too much to place her life easily in another's hands. When she finally spoke her name, it came like a declaration carved against the weight of her weakness. "Ampetu," she said, "daughter of Tatanka," and the syllables carried both defiance and dignity. Samuel knew the name, feared in whispered tales of raids and battles, a chieftain whose warriors defended their land with unbreakable resolve, And here lay his daughter, wounded yet unbroken, fire burning in her eyes, even as fever hollowed her cheeks. In that moment, Samuel understood the danger that had entered his life. She was not only a stranger, she was a thread tied to power, to bloodlines, to a world that would never forgive easily. Yet still he could not look away. She tested her strength against pain, trying to rise though her body trembled, and he steadied her without thought, his hand firm yet gentle at her back. She studied him then, suspicion giving way to something quieter, an acknowledgement that though she had every reason to mistrust him, he had not abandoned her. As the days slipped forward, their words came like hesitant steps across thin ice, each syllable cautious yet necessary. She watched him tend the fire, mend straps, move about the cabin with the silence of a man long accustomed to loneliness. He, in turn, found his eyes drawn to her resilience, the way her hands, though trembling, insisted on pouring water, the way she lifted her chin though pain tugged at her body. They were strangers, bound by circumstance, yet the current between them grew undeniable, woven from moments too small to name, the brief touch of fingers as he passed her a cup, the faint curve of her lips when she heard him speak of his horse, the echo of her breath mingling with the crackle of flames at night. What had begun as suspicion slowly softened into something deeper, fragile as the first green blade pushing through winter earth, tender as the warmth of firelight after years of cold. And in that fragile space, Samuel began to feel the first stirrings of something he had not allowed himself in years, not merely responsibility, but the quiet, healing weight of connection. Morning light spilled across the plains in silver frost, and the small cabin, once only a shelter of silence, began to carry the rhythm of two lives bound together by necessity and something gentler that neither spoke aloud. Samuel returned from chopping wood to find Ampetu draped in a blanket by the doorway, her eyes fixed on the horizon as though the winds themselves carried whispers from her people. She did not ask for help when she shifted her weight, though the wound still tugged at her body with every breath. Pride held her upright, and Samuel, instead of scolding, allowed the strength of her spirit to stand as its own medicine. Their words remained few, yet each carried weight. When he spoke of Buck, his chestnut gelding, whose patience had been his only company for years, she listened intently, her lips curving in the faintest shadow of a smile before it vanished again. In return, she told him of her people's songs, voices rising beneath starlit skies, drums pulsing like heartbeats, sage smoke curling toward the heavens in prayer. Her voice carried the warmth of memory, and Samuel found himself closing his eyes, as if he could hear that distant music healing something deep within him that solitude had never touched. Evening came with the scent of firewood and simmering stew, the glow of flames painting her face in shades of gold. Samuel caught her studying the brass button that hung from the cord at his neck, the relic of a soldier's life he had tried to bury. He spoke of it sparingly, of the comrade who had died while he had lived, of the guilt that clung to him like shadow. She regarded him quietly, then said words that pierced through him more deeply than any blade. "You carry it because you cannot let it go." Her truth opened a door inside him he had long kept locked, and though he turned away to busy his hands, he felt the shift, the soft uncoiling of chains he had worn too long. Later, as the fire burned low and shadows stretched across the floor, Ampetu, began to hum. The melody, haunting yet tender, filled the silence with something unspoken. Sorrow laced with strength, pain softened by endurance. Samuel set aside his work, listening, and when the final note faded, he whispered, "It suits you." Their eyes met, and in that fragile stillness something passed between them, unseen, unmeasured, yet undeniable. The days followed with a rhythm of shared survival. His axe splitting wood, her hands grinding herbs, his traps set in the forest, her blade skinning rabbits with quiet precision. Once, when his attempt at baking bread turned heavy and clumsy, her soft laughter startled him, warm and light, wrapping around his heart with a tenderness he had thought long lost. He grumbled at her teasing, but secretly cherished the sound, for it carried healing into the very marrow of his solitude. Slowly, the cabin ceased to be his alone. It became theirs, not claimed by words, but by presence, by firelight, by the simple act of two lives brushing against each other in quiet companionship. At night, when the wind howled outside and her breathing steadied across the room, Samuel lay awake not with regret, but with the stirring of something he had not felt in years. The walls of exile he had built around himself no longer seemed like protection. They seemed like a prison crumbling under the warmth of her nearness. And deep within, though he barely dared to name it, he felt the fragile, healing flame of love beginning to take root. The snow arrived earlier than Samuel expected, drifting down in pale silence, softening the harsh edges of the land. Inside the cabin, firelight wrapped them in warmth, its glow trembling across rough walls that now seemed less like barriers and more like witnesses to something quietly blossoming. Ampetu had grown stronger, her steps firmer, her voice no longer faint with fever. Yet with her strength came determination, and Samuel felt the undercurrent of it each time her gaze lingered on the horizon, each time her lips parted as if to speak of leaving, but closed again. Her presence filled the cabin with a kind of healing he had never known, her laughter hidden in small moments, her pride sparking against his silence, her very breath softening the loneliness that had once devoured him whole. He told himself not to notice, but he found his eyes drifting to her when she hummed near the fire, the sound weaving into him like thread binding an old wound. He told himself it was only gratitude, yet when her smile appeared fleetingly, it struck deeper than any blade of memory. One evening, as wind shrieked through the shutters and the world outside vanished into white, Ampetu spoke of her people again, her voice low, steady, carrying the rhythm of drums and the smoke of sage. She spoke of circles of dancers under stars, of songs that carried the weight of generations, and Samuel felt something tighten in his chest, a longing not for what he had lost, but for what he had never known. Belonging. He shared, in turn, the fragments of his own past, the brass button at his neck, the soldier's life he had abandoned, the shame that clung like shadow. She listened, her eyes steady, unflinching, and when she spoke, it was not with pity, but with truth. "You carry it because you cannot set it down," she said softly, and the words struck like a balm, painful yet healing, reminding him that even wounds unseen demanded tending. For the first time in years, he felt the walls within him begin to crumble, not with force, but with the gentle persistence of trust. The days unfolded like threads, weaving a quiet tapestry. He taught her how to carve wood for snares. She taught him the herbs that soothed fever and pain. He laughed, startled, when she teased his clumsy cooking, and her smile lingered in the air long after. At night, when silence fell and her breath deepened into sleep, Samuel lay awake, staring at the rafters, but no longer haunted by echoes of regret. Instead, he felt the fire of something unnamed but undeniable, a warmth that spread through him, not with urgency, but with the patient strength of roots anchoring in frozen soil. The cabin, once suffocating, now breathed with life, and though neither spoke of it aloud, the bond between them grew, fragile yet unbreakable, a quiet promise waiting to be tested. Outside, the snow thickened, blanketing the valley in silence, but within, the air shimmered with the pulse of two hearts slowly finding one another, carrying them closer to a truth neither had sought, yet both could no longer resist. The hush of winter deepened, snow settling like a shroud across the valley, but within the cabin the air pulsed with a warmth Samuel had not felt in years. Ampetu's strength had returned fully, her movements steady, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had survived more than her years should have allowed. Yet the peace was fragile, threaded with the pull of inevitability. Each dawn she stood at the doorway, her shawl drawn close, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as though the wind itself carried the cries of her people. One morning, her voice broke the silence, steady yet edged with urgency. "I cannot stay," she said, her gaze burning with both sorrow and determination. Samuel's chest tightened as he set the bucket of water down, snow melting in rivulets at his boots. He tried to reason, his voice heavy with concern, speaking of storms and trails buried under white, of wounds not yet healed. But her answer came sharp and unwavering. Her father must know she lived. Her people must not believe her spirit lost to the snow. In her eyes was a fire that no winter could quench, a duty greater than her own body's pain. Before he could form a reply, the sound came, thunder rolling not from the sky but from the earth itself. Hooves, countless and relentless, shaking the ground beneath them. Bucks snorted and pawed in alarm from the corral. Samuel dropped the bucket, his pulse surging with instinct, and climbed to the roof of the cabin. What he saw turned his blood cold. Over the ridge poured a flood of riders, Lakota warriors in numbers that swallowed the horizon. Lances gleamed in pale light, rifles caught the glint of snow, banners of red and black snapped in the icy wind. They spread in a circle, tightening like wolves around prey, their presence both magnificent and menacing. At their head rode a man broad-shouldered and commanding, silver streaking his braids, his eyes as fathomless as the midnight plains. Samuel needed no name spoken to know who he was. Tatanka, the chief, Ampetu's father. Inside the cabin, Ampetu stood at the threshold, her face pale yet resolute, her voice a whisper that trembled with both fear and love. "It is my father." Samuel descended, rifle in hand, though kept lowered, every nerve taut as the warriors reined their horses to a halt. The silence that followed was as sharp as a drawn blade. Bows rose, arrows ready, yet no one loosed them. Tatanka urged his horse forward, his presence cutting through the cold like iron. His gaze fell upon his daughter, and for the briefest heartbeat the mask of the warrior faltered, grief giving way to relief. Words flew swiftly between father and daughter, urgent, fierce, carried in the rolling cadence of Lakota. Samuel could not understand. All he could feel was the air itself strung tight with danger, every heartbeat a thread that could snap at the smallest wrong move. At last, Tatanka's eyes turned upon him, dark and heavy with judgment. "My daughter says you saved her," he said in deliberate English, his voice low, yet carrying the weight of command. "You cared for her wound. You did not harm her." Samuel stood tall, despite the tremor in his chest. "That's the truth," he answered, his tone steady, stripped of defense, only of fact. But Tatanka's face hardened, his voice slicing through the air. "My warriors see only your skin, the rifles on your wall, the smoke of your fire. They remember the blood of kin spilled by men who look like you. They demand justice." Snow drifted silently between them, cold against Samuel's face as he swallowed the words pressing in his throat. "I am not a soldier now," he said quietly, yet firmly, each syllable a stone placed in the fragile bridge between them. The circle of warriors shifted, bows still drawn, the storm of violence waiting on a single command. Samuel's heart pounded, yet within him rose a strange calm, the same calm he had felt when he chose to save Ampitu. The choice was no longer about solitude or survival. It was about honor, about life, about the fragile, healing bond that now stood between him and the blades of 100 warriors. And though death loomed closer than breath, he felt her presence beside him, steady and warm, anchoring him against the storm. Tatanka's gaze weighed Samuel, as though he were iron pulled from the earth, tested for flaws. His words cut the frozen air like steel. "If you saved her, then you are bound among my people. A man who preserves the life of a maiden owes her honor. Without it, there is only suspicion and war." The circle of warriors leaned forward in silence, the draw of their bows taut with expectation. Samuel felt his pulse hammer in his throat, yet his voice came low and steady. "What do you mean?" The answer struck like a blow. "You will take her as your wife. Then my warriors will see not an enemy, but a man of honor. Refuse, and you die. Blood will answer blood." The snow fell heavier, cloaking the valley in a hush that made every breath sound like thunder. Samuel's hands tightened at his sides. He had built his life upon solitude, had chosen silence as a shield, and yet now the world demanded he step forward, not back. His eyes found Ampetu's, shimmering not only with gratitude, but with something deeper, an unspoken strength, a willingness to stand beside him no matter the path chosen. For a long moment he stood in that fragile space between life and death, solitude and belonging, silence and song. Then, slowly, he set the rifle aside, letting it sink into the snow with a sound that echoed like a verdict. He stepped closer to her, his breath mingling with hers in the cold, his hands reaching for hers, small and trembling but steady. "I never thought I'd bind myself again," he said, his voice carrying across the frozen circle. "But I will not deny what has already begun. I will honor her. I will be the man she deserves." A ripple passed through the gathered warriors, a murmur like wind moving through tall grass. Tatanka's stern face softened, almost imperceptibly, and he inclined his head. "So be it." The bows lowered, the air releasing its tight grip, and what had been a heartbeat from slaughter became instead a beginning, unexpected, fierce, destined. That night the cabin glowed with a quieter fire. Tatanka entered, his presence filling the small space, his eyes sweeping over his daughter, alive and strong, then settling upon Samuel. Their words were measured, but beneath them ran the weight of transformation. Samuel admitted what he had carried: shame, regret, the silence of years wasted. Tatanka spoke of his people bleeding, of children needing voices to rise for them, of warriors who fought not for vengeance but for survival. And through it all, Ampetu stood steady, her hand brushing Samuel's, her eyes a healing flame that told him he was no longer alone. "I came here to disappear," he confessed, his voice roughened by truth. "But since she entered this cabin, I have seen more life than in all my years of silence. If she walks with you, I will walk too." Tatanka's eyes searched him, finding no lie, and his hand came down heavy upon Samuel's shoulder. "Then your life as a man apart ends here. Tomorrow you will leave this place. You will stand, not behind walls of wood, but among us." The fire crackled low, but it was no longer the fire of exile. It was the fire of passage, of two souls bound not only by circumstance but by choice. Ampetu leaned into him, her head resting lightly against his shoulder, her voice a whisper carrying warmth through the cold. "You are not alone anymore." Samuel's arm wrapped around her, steady, anchoring, the truth of her words healing every wound solitude had carved. "No," he breathed, his voice sure, "and I won't be again." Outside, snow fell in soft silence, erasing old tracks, promising new paths. Inside, two hearts, once broken and wandering, now beat in rhythm, already bound to a future neither had sought, but both were ready to claim. And beyond the cabin walls, the world waited, endless, harsh, alive, yet no longer something to flee, but something to walk into together. Dawn rose pale and silver across the snowbound valley, light spilling over the hills like a quiet blessing. Samuel stood outside the cabin with Buck saddled, his few belongings strapped tight, the life of solitude he had clung to for years reduced to a shell of rough-hewn logs behind him. Beside him stood Ampetu, her shawl drawn close, her eyes bright with resolve, her presence a flame against the cold morning. Beyond them, Tatanka and his warriors gathered, their voices low, their horses restless, the breath of beasts and men mingling in the crisp air. This was no raid now, no trial of suspicion. It was a passage. The chief raised his voice so all could hear. "This man once sought only silence. Now he chooses to walk with us. From this day, he is not alone." A cry surged from the warriors, rolling like thunder across the frozen land. Not as a threat, but as welcome, a song of belonging. Samuel felt it deep in his chest, as if the heartbeat of the plains themselves had reached for him, binding him not by fear, but by promise. He looked once more at the cabin, its chimney breathing weak smoke into the sky. Memories flickered there, nights of brooding silence, mornings of endless toil, years where regret spoke louder than wind. It had sheltered him, but it had never healed him. Healing had come with her, the girl he had lifted from blood and snow, whose strength had coaxed the fire of life back into his own heart. Ampetu mounted her horse, her hair catching the sunlight like threads of flame, her posture proud and unyielding. Samuel swung into Buck's saddle, and together they turned toward the waiting circle of warriors. With each stride, the snow muffled the sound of hooves, but in his chest Samuel felt the rhythm of a new beginning, each beat carrying him further from exile and closer to belonging. That evening, under a wide sky scattered with stars, the Lakota gathered around a great fire. Sparks leapt high, vanishing into the heavens as drums began their low, steady pulse. Samuel stood among them, Ampetu's hand clasped in his, her warmth steady as flame. Tatanka's voice rose deep and commanding. "This man saved my daughter, but more than that, he chose to walk with us. Let all here witness this bond." Spears pounded the earth, voices rose in chant, and the rhythm surged through Samuel's body, binding him to the circle, to the fire, to a people who had opened the path of life before him. He looked at Ampetu, her amber-flecked eyes reflecting the flames, and knew she was no longer simply the girl he had saved. She was his partner, his compass, the healing breath that had lifted him from shadows into the wide, unbroken light of love. The fire blazed higher, casting them both in gold. Behind them lay the cabin of silence, its walls swallowed by distance. Before them stretched the endless plains, fierce yet alive, filled with struggle and hope. Samuel Whitlock was no longer a man apart. He was a warrior among warriors, bound by love, ready to rise and fight with the woman who had given him back his life. And as the chant of the tribe lifted into the night, Samuel knew that the story written upon snow and flame would not end in solitude, but in the embrace of belonging, the healing fire of love carrying them forward into all that awaited. If this story has touched something in your heart, let your voice join the circle. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Share the warmth by liking this tale, and walk with us into the next journey by subscribing. For every story we tell is not just of the past, but of love, healing, and courage that still burns bright today, and your presence keeps that fire alive.